They said the Nile was not a river but a memory, water remembering the path the light once carved across the land. Long before crowns were forged and names were cut into granite, before gods were painted with gold and given temples of stone, there was a night when the desert itself glowed. Not with fire, with something older. A light that tasted like copper on the tongue and hummed through bone. On that night the first pact was made. Light would borrow flesh, and flesh would borrow light. From this union, the gods of the two lands were born. They did not call it divinity, they called it balance, breath and blaze, clay and dawn. The first priests were not keepers of law or tax, they were keepers of thresholds. They guarded a chamber beneath a sand-buried hill, where the air had the weight of the deep river, and the silence rang like metal. They named that chamber the House of First Dawn. In its center stood a stone that was not a stone, black like the skin of night after rain, veined with a dull shine. When touched, it vibrated. When sung to, it answered. They learned by listening that the stone could be persuaded. Not forced, not broken, persuaded. With tones held on the edge of breath, with hands motionless and hearts steady, they coaxed the dark into opening. And when it opened, light spilled without flame, quiet, thick, a glow like the inside of an eyelid facing the sun. Those who stood nearest felt the blood in their wrists change its rhythm to the beat of a vast, slow heart. Then the light formed a pillar, and inside that pillar shapes began to appear. Not faces, not yet, motions, gestures, a hand like a river bent around a bend, a shoulder like a dune in wind. The first hint that light remembered how to become form. To the ones who watched, the task was clear. Teach the light to wear skin. Not to trick it, not to trap it, but to invite it across the threshold that separates breath from brightness, body from beam. They studied the bodies of animals, the way an ibis's neck curves to balance the weight of thought, the way a bull's chest carries thunder, the way a jackal puts its ear to the earth as if listening for the footsteps of the dead. They studied humans too, shoulder to wrist, heel to back of head, the architecture of hunger and song, and they found that the light chose certain forms more easily than others. The ibis for the mind that measures, the bull for the power that sustains, the falcon for the sight that rules from above, the jackal for the guide who keeps the living from losing themselves among the sleeping. So they called the light by names of function rather than flattery. Not God, but the one who raises, the one who opens, the one who weighs, the one who travels the hidden path. Names as tools, names as doors. There was a priest whose name has not survived, though his hands left marks in the stone like ripples that never ended. He was not chief among them, but he stood longer than the others and learned the stillness that persuades. His eyes were the color of wet earth after flood, and in them lived the kind of patience that makes rivers change direction. He did not love power, he loved accuracy. To him they entrusted the fourth song, the measure that binds light to breath without burning the body that welcomes it. He descended each night with a small bowl of river water and a reed that hummed when stroked. He bathed his wrists, his ankles, the back of his neck. He stood before the black-veined stone and sang without sound. The song moved through his bones, and the stone answered. The chamber brightened, became pale as dawn mist, then thicker, like milk warming. The light stood up. It took the shape of a young falcon, then the shape of a woman with the shoulders of a lioness, then a single eye that filled the room and saw without accusing. When it settled, the priest inclined his head, and the light did the same. The threshold had opened. "Flesh is a house," he murmured, a lesson for the apprentices sitting around the walls where the dark was still dark. "A house must be worthy of the guest. We do not seize the guest. We prepare the house." From the clay pits by the river, they brought bodies without breath, statues of compacted silt and crushed shell faces carved not for beauty, but for function. The nose to taste the wind, the mouth to shape a name, the hands to carry the weight of an oath. Into these vessels they poured a little blood, a little oil, a little milk, not as magic, but as hospitality. Then they sang. When the light entered, it did not possess, it inhabited. It learned the joints and the hinge of a knee, the tether of a tendon. The first to rise was a falcon-headed figure, whose sight burned like a path straight through stone. The second had the ears of a desert dog and smelled the grief of men like smoke. The third wore an ibis's calm and counted without fingers. They were not pictures of gods. They were instruments for light to play. Outside the chamber, the red land burned and the black land drank. People planted by the stars and harvested by the flood. And when the flood was late, they sang to the river. When the wind was cruel, they sang to the dunes. When a child was born, they touched the infant's chest with their foreheads and said, "Remember your exit, remember your return." Not prayer. Instruction, a way of keeping doors clear. But balance always asks for its price. The more perfect the invitation, the greater the temptation to compel rather than persuade. There was an apprentice whose fingers were too quick, whose breath rose too fast. He loved the glow more than the silence that allows it. Where the priest waited, he demanded. Where the chamber trembled and calmed, he struck the reed harder. He wanted the pillar of light to answer to him, not to the order of things. In his eagerness, he deepened the tone beyond the fourth song, and the stone answered with a brightness that made the skin feel thin. "Stop," the priest whispered. The apprentice did not stop. He lowered the bowl of water and pressed both hands flat on the stone. The light climbed his arms like a living thread. It rose into his mouth. His eyes went white, not rolled, not blind, white like a sky without sun. For a breath, he stood like a statue made of mourning. Then the light shook him, not in anger, in reluctance. The body tried to contain what it could not nourish. The reed snapped, the bowl cracked. He fell. He did not die. He lost the path back to his name. He lived among them after, simple and smiling, useful in small ways, waves without shore. When children asked, "What is wrong with him?" the priest answered, "He tried to keep the river in his hands." They learned, they slowed. They gave the light fewer bodies and stronger houses. They inscribed upon every wrist and ankle and neck the sign of measure, so nothing would mistake a vessel for the sun itself. They fed their guests with sound and quiet, warmed them with breath, shaded them with night, returned them with gratitude. The union of light and flesh became rhythm, rising with certain stars, descending with others, crossing the river of sleep without losing the shore of waking. A city began to rise above the chamber, a place not of conquest, but of calibration. People came from afar to learn how to align a heart with a horizon. In those days the sky was closer, or the eyes were deeper. It is said that once, at the height of a dry year, a great eye appeared over the desert at noon, crowned not with flame, but with patient radiance. The fields stopped cracking. The children did not faint. The eye blinked once, and the people bowed without fear. They did not call it a miracle. They called it a reminder. Then came the woman with the hair like river mud, and wrists thinner than reeds. She had walked from the west with dust on her teeth, and a small child bound to her back. She entered the city as one enters a living thing, hand on the wall, listening. When she spoke, her voice was like a cool jar on a hot day. "I have a name," she said, "but it is not important. I have a question, but it is not mine. The question belongs to the land that sent me." They brought her to the priest. He saw in her eyes the horizon that makes men weep at dawn without knowing why. "Ask," he said, "why does the light leave?" "Because doors close." "Why do doors close?" "Because we forget to oil the hinges." "And what is the oil?" The priest lifted his hand and touched the child asleep against her back. The child did not wake. "Memory," he said. "The body remembers to breathe without instruction. The village remembers to store grain. The river remembers its flood. And people remember the names of the ones they love. This is oil. The light leaves when we forget that we are more than mouths." She nodded. "Teach me the hinge." He taught her the rhythm that holds skin open without tearing it, the measure that binds without tying. She learned as leaves learn wind, by moving. The chamber woke for her the way a child wakes for the heartbeat that made it. When the pillar rose, she did not bow. She did not dare to touch. She stood as one stands at the door of a sleeping parent and simply listened. The pillar leaned to her. Some called her a queen. She called herself a hand. For a season, the city thrived in this humility. The bodies that welcomed light returned it willingly, and those who watched did not mistake the instrument for the player. The harvests came true. The dead crossed the hidden path without dragging their shadows behind them. Even the jackals forgot to steal and sat on the temple stairs like old men in the afternoon. But people are drought and flood. In the 5th year of the woman's learning, a warband arrived from the southern Reed Islands, carrying spears tipped with river bone and shields lacquered with pitch. They demanded the light as if it were a tax. "Give us your pillar," they shouted, "and we will never starve." They did not understand. What saves the village destroys the world when misused. The priest said no. The woman said no. The city barred the door to the chamber. The warband laughed and set the outer roofs on fire. The great eye did not appear. The river did not rise from the earth like a snake to extinguish the flames. The air tasted like panic. The woman carried the child to the threshold and turned to the priest. "Open," he hesitated. "If we invite in fear, fear will wear the body we offer." "Open," she said again, more softly, "or everything we taught the desert will be forgotten in a single hour." He opened. The stone answered. The pillar rose, shimmering like a promise about to fail. The warband felt it and faltered. The leader lifted his spear and took a step. The woman took off the bracelet from her wrist, the thin copper ring inscribed with the measure sign, and placed it on the child. "Remember," she whispered, though the child was still asleep. Then she walked into the light. It was not martyrdom, it was hospitality at the edge of possibility. Her body became a house bigger than a house should be, and the light, receiving her, stretched to fit her generosity. The pillar grew tall enough to cast a shadow over the entire city. The fire on the roofs curled back on itself, confused. The warband dropped their spears and covered their faces. The woman raised her right hand, and wind came from the east, carrying the smell of figs and cool clay. The flames sank like tired animals and went out. Those who watched wept, not because a savior had come, but because they recognized the truth. The door of doors had opened wider than it could safely open. When it closed, it would close hard. The woman stepped backward out of the light, and the light, reluctant, followed like a lover not ready to leave. The priest sang the 4th song with a steadiness that left his lips bleeding. The pillar yielded by a finger's width, then by a palm, then by a breath. The stone cooled. The chamber darkened. The wind fell still. The woman's hair was white, not with age, with the ash of having been too close to the heart of mourning. She looked at the child, the bracelet too large on the tiny wrist, and smiled. "Doors close," she said to the priest. "Oil them for me." He bowed, and the floor bowed with him. After that day, the city changed its mind about itself. It built fewer statues and more schools of silence. It kept reed mats by the thresholds so feet would learn to wipe dust off before entering sacred places. It taught children to name their shadows and feed them with stories at dusk so no shadow would go hungry. It taught the dying to relax their hands so death would not have to pry fingers from the living. It taught the living to trace the sign of measure on their wrists before speaking the names of things. It honored the woman by never saying her name. Seasons later, when the priest's hands shook too much to carry the bowl without spilling, he took the child, now tall, eyes heavy with dawn, and led him to the house of first dawn. He placed the copper bracelet on the stone. The chamber brightened by the width of a thought. "Do you hear it?" he asked. The youth nodded. "It is like the Nile in flood, but slower. It is the world asking a question. It always asks. Sometimes we answer. Sometimes we keep quiet so it can hear itself." "And the gods?" "The gods are what happens when the answer and the quiet agree." The youth placed his hands on the stone as the priest had taught him. He did not press, he listened with his skin. The pillar rose as a reed rises in a morning without wind. It formed a hand, then a face, then a falcon's eye that could see through a man and not harm him by seeing. The youth did not smile, he did not weep. He said, "Welcome." Above them, the city slept. Beyond them, the river breathed. Around them, the desert held its long, patient note. The warband never returned. They had tasted a door and found their tongues unfit for the language it requires. The woman grew old, not like a reed dries, but like a jar seasons. Useful, quiet, never empty. And the priest, when he lay down for the last time, turned his face to the east and exhaled as one who has finished measuring. In later ages, When crowns grew heavy and gold tried to pass for light, the house of first dawn was buried by accident and then on purpose. The city forgot and then pretended not to remember. Priests who loved power more than accuracy called the guests by their own names and told the people that the sun belonged to them. Statues became trophies. Songs became codes. No one could sing without choking. The copper bracelet turned green and hid itself in a crack in the wall. But night still glows when the air is right. Sometimes, in the lowest hour before morning, jackals pause mid-step and tilt their heads as if a whisper had crossed the sand. Sometimes, an old woman wakes with tears drying on her face and cannot say whether she has dreamed of a child or of a city. Sometimes the river rises one finger higher than it should and leaves on the bank a small bowl, unbroken, cold as if it had been waiting under stone for hands that know how to hold. Those who know how to listen still oil the hinges. They do it without spectacle. A hand on a wrist, a breath measured against a star, a door quietly closing so the house can rest. They do not ask the light to stay. They prepare a room. If the guest comes, they say welcome. If the guest does not, they keep the room clean. And if you ever stand in a place where air tastes like copper and the hair on your arms rises without fear, if you ever hear a tone that seems to come from the back of your own skull, soft, immense, patient, do not speak first. Touch your wrist. Remember your exit. Remember your return. If a pillar rises, do not bow. Do not ask for favor. Say only, I have kept the house ready. The rest is not yours. The Nile is a memory. The desert is a sentence half spoken. The light remembers how to wear skin, and flesh remembers how to become light. Between them stands the door. It opens, it closes. Those who would rule it lose their names. Those who would serve it keep the world from breaking. When the last star has finished cooling the last blade of reed, when gold has forgotten that it once pretended to be sun, a chamber deeper than names will stir. A reed will hum. A bowl will not spill. A bracelet no larger than a childish wrist will flash like morning at the bottom of the dark. And somewhere, on a hill of chalk and grass in a land of long shadows, stones will begin to sing. Prepare yourself for the next secret, when circles of stone call down a sky that opens like a door, and night itself learns the measure that lifts the light.